Cop pulled a gun on John Kennedy. 5 minutes later, he was the one arrested. The night was heavy with silence, the kind that blankets a lonely highway and makes every sound sharper, more deliberate. John Kennedy, a U.S. Senator from Louisiana, gripped the wheel of his dark blue sedan, his eyes fixed on the stretch of asphalt illuminated by his headlights. It had been a long day, meetings that dragged into debates, phone calls that never seemed to end, and the constant hum of decisions that weighed on his shoulders. Now, well past midnight, he was finally heading home, the road cutting through a quiet corner of his state where the streetlights were sparse and the stars burned brighter than the city ever allowed. The hum of the engine was his only companion, a steady rhythm that matched the cadence of his thoughts. He wasn't speeding 65 miles per hour, right on the limit, his driving steady his hands at 10 and 2. Years in public life had taught him discipline, precision, the kind of caution that kept you out of trouble. So when the sharp flash of red and blue lights exploded in his rearview mirror, his first reaction wasn't fear or guilt, but confusion. His brow furrowed, his gaze flicking to the speedometer, then back to the road. No mistakes, no infractions. He hadn't swerved, hadn't run a light. There was no reason for this. Yet the police cruiser behind him didn't waver, its siren cutting through the night like a blade. Kennedy exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening as he signaled to the right, guiding his car onto the shoulder with the practiced ease of someone who knew the rules. He'd worked with law enforcement before, respected the job, understood the weight of a badge. This was routine, he told himself, just a quick check. A misunderstanding. But as the cruiser rolled to a stop behind him, its headlights bathing his car in a harsh white glare, a prickle of unease settled in his chest. Something about the way the officer was taking his time, too long, too deliberate, felt off. Kennedy adjusted his rearview mirror, trying to catch a glimpse of the man behind him. The cruiser's door finally creaked open, and out stepped Officer Daniel Carnes, a figure cut sharp against the glow of the headlights. He wasn't tall, but his posture screamed authority, the kind that wasn't earned but demanded. His left hand rested on his belt fingers, brushing the holster of his firearm, while his right swung a flashlight back and forth, the beam slicing through the darkness. His boots crunched against the gravel as he approached each step, measured, aggressive. Kennedy lowered his window, keeping both hands visible on the wheel, palms upturned in a gesture of compliance. "Evening, officer," he said, his voice calm, steady, the same tone he used in Senate chambers to diffuse tension. But Carnes didn't return the greeting. He leaned down, his flashlight sweeping across Kennedy's face, lingering too long, the beam blinding. "License and registration." He barked, his voice flat, chewing gum with a slow, deliberate rhythm that grated on Kennedy's nerves. No explanation, no courtesy, just a demand. Kennedy's eyes narrowed slightly. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" he said, keeping his tone even professional. Carnes stopped chewing for a moment, his head tilting as if the question itself was an insult. "License. Registration." The words were slower this time, each one clipped a warning wrapped in them. Kennedy held back a sigh. He'd seen men like this before, small men with big egos, the kind who leaned on their badge to feel taller. But he wasn't here to argue, not yet. "All right, officer," he said, his voice still measured. "I'm reaching for my wallet in the center console." He moved slowly, deliberately, his right hand sliding toward the console while his left stayed on the wheel. He pulled out his wallet, flipping it open to reveal his driver's license, and beside it, his Senate ID, the seal of the United States Senate, unmistakable, even in the dim light. He held it out, expecting the officer's demeanor to shift for recognition, to soften the edge in the air. But Carnes barely glanced at it. His eyes flicked to the ID, then back to Kennedy's face, his expression unchanging, cold. "Senator," he said the word, dripping with skepticism, as if it were a title Kennedy had printed off the internet. Kennedy nodded once, his patience thinning, but his composure intact. "Yes, sir. Now, can you tell me why I'm being stopped?" Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the cruiser's engine. Carnes chewed his gum again, his jaw working slowly, deliberately before he spoke. "Step out of the vehicle." The words hit like a punch, not because they were loud, but because they were wrong. Kennedy blinked, his mind racing to process the command. "Excuse me," he said, his voice still calm but sharper now, a thread of steel running through it. Carnes took a half-step back, his right hand now hovering near his firearm, his left still gripping the flashlight. "Step out of the car." The tension in the air thickened, pressing against Kennedy's ribs like a physical weight. He'd been in high-stakes situations, before committee hearings, public confrontations, even threats from those who didn't like his votes. But this was different. This wasn't a debate. This was a man with a gun, a badge, and an attitude that screamed trouble. Kennedy's pulse stayed steady, but his mind was already running through scenarios, calculating risks. He knew the protocol, knew his rights, but he also knew how fast things could spiral when a cop decided he didn't like you. "Officer, I've complied with your requests," he said, his voice low, deliberate. "I've shown you my identification. There's no reason for this. If there's an issue, let's call your supervisor." Carnes' jaw flexed, irritation flashing across his face. "I don't need a supervisor." He snapped, his voice rising just enough to betray his temper. "I said, get out." Kennedy didn't move, not out of defiance, but out of caution. His instincts, honed over years of navigating power dynamics, told him this wasn't about a traffic stop. This was about control, about a man who saw a challenge in Kennedy's calm, in his title, in his refusal to cower. "On what grounds?" Officer Kennedy asked, his tone unwavering, his eyes as locked on Carnes's. For the first time, the officer hesitated, his lips parting as if searching for a response. But instead of answering, he did something worse. He took a step closer, the flashlight dropping to his side, and his right hand unfastened the snap on his holster. The click was soft, but it echoed in Kennedy's ears like a gunshot. "I don't have to explain myself to you, Carnes," said his voice low, dangerous. The air between them crackled, the weight of the moment pressing down hard. Kennedy's heart beat steady, but his mind was a storm of calculations. He'd read the reports, seen the news stops like this going wrong, escalating in seconds, ending in tragedy. He wasn't naive. He knew the power a badge carried, and he knew the danger of a man who thought he was untouchable. "You do, actually," Kennedy said, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the tension like a blade. "You're required to articulate a reason for this stop, and for any further action. I'm a United States Senator, and I'm not stepping out until you tell me why." Carnes's face twisted, a flash of anger breaking through his composure. "I don't give a damn who you are." He spat, his hand now resting on the grip of his gun. The flashlight beam swung wildly as he leaned closer, his silhouette looming in the window. "You think that ID means something to me? Get out, or I'll make you." The threat hung in this air, raw and unfiltered, and for the first time Kennedy felt the weight of real danger. Not the abstract kind he faced in politics, but the kind that came with a loaded weapon and a man who didn't care about consequences. Kennedy's fingers tightened on the wheel, not out of fear, but out of focus. He knew he had to stay in control, to keep this from spiraling. "Officer, you're making a mistake," he said, his voice steady, his gaze unyielding. "You're escalating without cause. Let's de-escalate this. Call your supervisor, and we'll sort it out." Carnes let out a low, humorless chuckle, the sound chilling in its arrogance. The mistake, he said, was thinking, "You could pull rank on me." And then, before Kennedy could respond, Carnes reached for the door handle, his fingers curling around it with intent. The click of the handle sent a jolt through Kennedy's body, not fear, not yet, but a sharp awareness that this was no longer a routine stop. His left hand shot out, gripping the inside handle to keep the door shut. "Step back, officer," he said, his voice firm, commanding the kind of tone that had silenced rooms full of opponents. "You're out of line." Carnes didn't move. If anything, his grip on the door tightened, his knuckles paling under the strain. "I said get out," he growled, his voice raw, with the kind of authority that didn't ask for permission. Kennedy's mind raced, weighing his options. He could comply, step out, and hope Carnes didn't push further, but that meant surrendering control, putting himself at the mercy of a man who clearly had none. He could resist, stay in the car, but that risked escalation, and with Carnes's hand on his gun, escalation could be deadly. He'd seen the footage, read the stories, people who did everything right, and still didn't make it home. His Senate ID, his title, his years of service, they meant nothing to a man like Carnes, who saw only a challenge to his power. Kennedy's right hand twitched, itching to reach for his phone, but he knew any sudden movement could be misread, twisted into an excuse. "You're crossing a line," he said, his voice low, controlled but with an edge that carried weight. "You know who I am. You've seen my ID. This isn't worth your career." Carnes's lips curled into a smirk, his eyes narrowing. "Career," he said, almost laughing. "You think you can scare me with that I'm the law out here?" The arrogance in his voice was a spark, igniting something in Kennedy, not anger, but resolve. He'd spent his life fighting for what was right for the people of Louisiana, for the rule of law. He wasn't about to let a rogue cop rewrite the rules on a deserted highway. But before he could speak, the situation shifted. A faint sound broke through the tension, a rustle, then a voice, sharp and clear, cutting through the night like a lifeline. "Hey, I'm recording this." The shout came from the side of the road, piercing the suffocating silence. Kennedy's eyes flicked to the source, careful not to turn his head. A woman stood there, maybe 30 feet away. Her phone raised the glow of the screen, reflecting off her glasses. She was at a safe distance, but close enough for her camera to catch every detail: Carnes's gun, his stance, the senator pinned in his car. "You sure you want to do this, officer?" She called out, her voice steady, despite the weight of the moment. Carnes froze, his hand still on the door handle, but the shift in his posture was immediate. A flicker of hesitation, a crack in his armor. He didn't lower his gun, but his eyes darted toward the woman, then back to Kennedy. Calculating. Kennedy seized the moment. "Put the weapon down," he said, his voice stronger now, carrying the weight of authority he'd earned over decades. "You're being recorded. This is over." Carnes's jaw clenched, his breathing shallow, his mind clearly racing to find a way out. The woman, Sarah Kennedy would later learn, kept her phone steady, her voice ringing out again. "I've got it all, officer. The whole world's gonna see this." The words were a hammer striking at the foundation of Carnes's bravado. For a moment, no one moved, the air thick with the weight of what came next. Kennedy's heart pounded, but his face remained calm, his eyes locked on Carnes's. He knew this wasn't over, not yet. But the balance had shifted, and for the first time he felt the faint stirrings of hope that he'd make it through this night. The highway shoulder was a stage now lit by the harsh glare of headlights and the pulsing red and blue of Carnes's cruiser. John Kennedy stood beside his sedan, his hands still raised, not in surrender, but in a calculated show of restraint. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made every sound, the crunch of gravel, the hum of engines, the faint crackle of a police radio, feel like a prelude to chaos. Officer Daniel Carnes stood a few feet away, his hand no longer on his gun, but still hovering near his holster. His face, a mask of defiance, barely concealing the panic creeping into his eyes. Sarah, the witness, held her phone steady, its red recording light a silent accusation that kept Carnes in check. Her presence had shifted the dynamic, but the danger wasn't gone. Kennedy knew it, felt it in the way Carnes' jaw twitched, in the way his shoulders stayed rigid, as if he were still weighing whether he could salvage his authority. The senator's mind was sharp, processing every detail, the angle of Sarah's camera, the distance between him and Carnes, the faint sound of another siren growing louder in the distance. He'd been in tough spots before, but this was a different kind of battlefield, one where words and evidence were his only weapons. Carnes's eyes flicked toward Sarah again, his lips curling into a sneer. "Put that damn phone down!" He snapped, his voice raw with frustration, but there was a tremor in it now, a crack in the armor of his bravado. Sarah didn't flinch. Not a chance. She shot back, her voice steady, her phone unwavering. "You're not in charge here anymore." The words stung, and Carnes' face reddened, his hand twitching toward his belt, as if instinct were pulling him toward escalation. Kennedy saw at the moment where a desperate man might double down, and he spoke before Carnes could act. "Officer, you're on camera," he said, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Every move you make is being recorded. Think about what comes next." Carnes's gaze snapped back to Kennedy, his eyes narrowing, but he didn't respond. The senator held his ground, his hands still raised, his posture open but unyielding. He wasn't just a man in a suit anymore. He was a senator, a public figure, and he knew the weight his title carried, even if Carnes refused to acknowledge it. The distant siren grew louder, and within moments another police cruiser pulled up its lights, sweeping across the scene. The door swung open, and a second officer stepped out. Officer Blake, a broad-shouldered man with a face that betrayed no emotion. He strode toward Carnes, his eyes flicking between the senator, the camera, and his partner. "What's going on here?" Blake asked, his voice low, cautious, as if he were stepping into a minefield. Carnes didn't turn to face him, his eyes still locked on Kennedy. "Non-compliant driver." He said the words clipped, rehearsed, as if he'd used them 100 times before to justify his actions. Kennedy's jaw tightened. Non-compliant. The phrase was a weapon, one he'd heard in too many reports, seen in too many headlines. It was a code, a way to paint a victim as a threat, to twist the truth before it could take root. But this time, the truth had a witness, and it had a camera. Blake's gaze shifted to Kennedy, and for a fleeting moment, recognition flickered in his eyes. He'd seen the senator before on the news, in campaign ads, maybe even at a state event. His posture stiffened, but he didn't speak, his silence a signal that he was waiting for Carnes to lead. Kennedy seized the opening. "Officer Blake," he said, reading the nameplate in the dim light, his voice steady, authoritative. "I'm Senator John Kennedy. I was pulled over without cause, threatened with a firearm, and ordered out of my vehicle without explanation. I've complied with every reasonable request, and now I'm asking you to do your job. Detain Officer Carnes." The words landed like a gavel, clear and unyielding, and for the first time, Carnes's composure cracked. "You can't be serious," he spat, taking a step toward Kennedy, his hand brushing his holster again. Blake's arm shot out, stopping his partner mid-step. Easy, Blake muttered, his voice low, but there was tension in it, a warning. Sarah's voice cut through again, sharp and unrelenting. It's all on video, officers. The gun, the threats, everything. You want to be on the news tomorrow? Blake's eyes darted toward her, then back to Carnes, his mind clearly racing. Kennedy watched the exchange, his heart steady but his senses on high alert. He knew the power of a camera, the way it could shift a narrative, expose a lie. He also knew the danger of two officers caught in a corner, their careers on the line. Blake's radio crackled, a dispatcher's voice breaking the silence. Unit 12 status. Blake hesitated, his thumb hovering over the radio. Carnes's breathing was shallow now, his eyes darting between Kennedy, Sarah, and the approaching lights of yet another cruiser. The balance was tipping, and Kennedy knew he had to keep the pressure on. Officer Blake, he said, his voice softer now, almost conversational, but with an edge that carried weight. You've got a choice. You can back your partner and go down with him, or you can do what's right. You know who I am. You know this won't end here. Blake's face was unreadable, but his hand dropped from the radio, a small but significant gesture. Carnes saw it, and his anger erupted. You're not seriously listening to him, he snarled, turning on Blake. He's just some politician trying to pull rank. Blake didn't respond. His eyes fixed on Kennedy, calculating. The third cruiser screeched to a stop, and two more officers stepped out, their hands hovering near their holsters as they took in the scene. One of them, a lieutenant with silver bars on his collar, strode forward, his gaze sweeping from Carnes's tense stance to Sarah's phone to Kennedy's raised hands. Somebody want to explain this? The lieutenant demanded, his voice sharp, authoritative. Kennedy didn't hesitate. Lieutenant, I'm Senator John Kennedy, he said, lowering his hands slowly, deliberately, reclaiming control of the moment. Officer Carnes pulled me over without cause, threatened me with his weapon, and refused to acknowledge my identification. This woman has it all on video. I want him detained now. The lieutenant's eyes widened, recognition dawning. He turned to Carnes, his expression hardening. Is that true? Carnes's face twisted, a mix of defiance and desperation. He was non-compliant, he said, his voice weaker now, the excuse sounding hollow even to his own ears. Sarah stepped closer, her phone still recording. Non-compliant, she said, her voice dripping with disbelief. He showed you his ID, told you who he was, and you pulled a gun on him. It's all right here. She held up her phone, the screen glowing with the undeniable truth. The lieutenant's jaw tightened, his gaze shifting to Blake, who stood silent, his earlier neutrality now a liability. Cuff him, the lieutenant ordered, nodding toward Carnes. Blake hesitated, his loyalty to his partner warring with the reality of the situation. Now the lieutenant snapped, and Blake moved, pulling out his cuffs with a reluctant slowness. Carnes's face went pale, his bravado crumbling as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. This is a mistake, he muttered, his voice raw, disbelieving. You're gonna regret this. Kennedy watched, his expression unreadable, but inside he felt a surge of relief tempered by resolve. This wasn't over, not for Carnes, not for him, not for the system that had let this happen. The lieutenant turned to Blake. You too, he said, his voice cold. Blake's head snapped up, shock flashing across his face. Sir, I didn't, he started, but the lieutenant cut him off. You stood there and let it happen. That's enough. Blake's shoulders slumped, and he didn't resist as another officer cuffed him. The scene was surreal, the flashing lights casting long shadows across the pavement, Sarah's camera capturing every moment, every shift in power. Kennedy exhaled slowly, his hands now at his sides, the weight of the moment settling into his bones. He turned to Sarah, meeting her gaze. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet, but sincere. She nodded, lowering her phone but keeping it ready. "Somebody had to," she said, a faint tremor in her voice now that the adrenaline was fading. The lieutenant approached Kennedy, his expression a mix of respect and unease. "Senator, are you all right?" he asked, his tone formal but genuine. Kennedy nodded, his eyes still on Carnes, who was being led to a cruiser. His head bowed. "I'm fine," he said, his voice steady. "But this isn't about me. This is about what happens when power goes unchecked. I want internal affairs on this, and I want that video preserved." The lieutenant nodded, already pulling out his radio to make the call. As Carnes and Blake were loaded into separate cruisers, Kennedy's mind shifted to what came next. This wasn't just a bad stop. It was a symptom of something bigger, something he'd seen in the stories of his constituents in the letters that crossed his desk. He'd always believed in the rule of law in the men and women who upheld it, but tonight had shown him how fragile that system could be when the wrong people held the reins. Sarah's video was a weapon, one that could expose the truth, but it was only the beginning. The cruisers pulled away, their sirens fading into the night, but Kennedy knew the real fight was just starting. He'd make sure Carnes faced consequences, not just for him, but for everyone else who'd faced a gun and a badge and didn't have a camera to save them. The morning after the highway incident, the world seemed to shift on its axis. The video Sarah had recorded, a grainy but undeniable record of Officer Daniel Carnes's aggression and the tense standoff with Senator John Kennedy, exploded across social media before the sun had fully risen. By noon, news outlets were replaying the footage on a loop, the image of Carnes's hand on his gun, his sneer as he dismissed Kennedy's Senate ID, burned into the public's consciousness. Hashtags multiplied, OPEEDs poured in, and the Louisiana State Police headquarters was swarmed with reporters demanding answers. Kennedy sat in his office, a modest space lined with books and framed letters from constituents, his phone buzzing incessantly on the desk. He ignored it, his eyes fixed on a muted television screen where a pundit dissected the incident, gesturing wildly at a freeze frame of Carnes's face. The senator's expression was unreadable, but his mind was racing not with anger or vindication, but with a quiet, resolute determination. The night before had been about survival. Today was about accountability, not just for Carnes and Officer Blake, but for a system that had allowed their actions to go unchecked for too long. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin, and let the weight of the moment settle. This wasn't just his story anymore. It belonged to everyone who'd ever felt the sting of unchecked power. The fallout was swift. By mid-afternoon, the Louisiana State Police announced that Carnes had been stripped of his badge and charged with assault with a deadly weapon, a felony that carried the weight of years behind bars. Blake, his silent accomplice, was suspended indefinitely, his role as an enabler under scrutiny by Internal Affairs. The department issued a statement carefully worded to express regret without admitting systemic failure, but the public wasn't buying it. Protests formed outside the state capitol, signs demanding reform and transparency swaying in the humid air. Kennedy watched the coverage from his office, his jaw tight. He'd seen this before, outrage that flared bright and then faded, buried under bureaucracy or political maneuvering. He wasn't naive. He knew how easy it was for the powerful to wait out a scandal, to let the noise die down until the world moved on. But he also knew he had something they didn't: a platform, a voice, and a responsibility to use both. He picked up his phone, not to answer the barrage of calls, but to dial a number he'd saved the night before Sarah's. She answered on the second ring, her voice cautious but warm. "Senator," she said, the faintest hint of surprise in her tone. "I need your help," Kennedy said, his voice steady. "This isn't over. Meet me at the community center in Baton Rouge tomorrow night. We're going to talk to people, not just the press." The community center was a low brick building, its walls plastered with flyers for youth programs and voter drives, its parking lot filled with cars by the time Kennedy arrived the next evening. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation, the kind that comes when people know something bigger than themselves is at stake. The room was packed, mothers with children on their hips, retirees in folding chairs, young activists with notebooks and questions. Sarah stood near the front, her phone no longer a weapon, but a symbol, a reminder of what one person could do. Kennedy stepped to the podium, his suit slightly rumpled from a day of meetings, his eyes scanning the crowd. He didn't have a prepared speech, didn't need one. He'd spent his career talking to people, not at them, and tonight he wanted them to feel heard. "Good evening," he began, his voice carrying the same steady cadence that had calmed the highway standoff. "I'm here because of what happened 2 nights ago, but I'm also here because of what's happened too many times before that. What happened to me wasn't new, it was just caught on camera." A murmur rippled through the crowd, heads nodding, some faces tight, with the kind of pain that comes from lived experience. Kennedy paused, letting the room settle. "I'm a senator," he continued, "but that night I was just a man on a road facing a gun and a badge. If it wasn't for Sarah," he gestured toward her and the room erupted in applause, "I might not be standing here. But here's the truth. Most folks don't have a camera or a title or a way to make the world listen. And that's why we're here. To make sure they do." He spoke for 10 minutes, not about himself, but about the letters he'd received over the years. Stories of traffic stops gone wrong, of families torn apart by a system that too often protected its own. He didn't sugarcoat the challenges, didn't promise easy fixes, but he laid out a plan, a push for mandatory body cameras, independent oversight boards, and stricter penalties for officers who abused their power. The crowd listened, some taking notes, others whispering to neighbors, a shared sense of purpose growing with every word. When Sarah took the microphone, the room went quiet. She wasn't a politician, wasn't used to speaking to crowds, but her voice was steady, raw, with the weight of what she'd seen. "I was scared," that night she admitted, her hands gripping the podium. "I thought about driving past, minding my own business. But I couldn't. Because if we all look away, nothing changes." She told her story, not just the video, but why she'd stopped, why she'd raised her phone. She talked about her brother pulled over years ago, humiliated for no reason, his story buried, because no one was there to record it. "This isn't about one senator or one cop," she said, her eyes sweeping the room. "It's about all of us. We've got to hold the line, not just when it's on the news, but every day." The applause was deafening, a release of frustration and hope, and Kennedy felt something shift inside him, a recognition that this moment, this room, was the real battleground. The meeting stretched into the night, questions and stories pouring out. A mother spoke of her son, arrested on flimsy charges, his life derailed. A retired officer admitted to seeing colleagues cross lines, his silence a regret he carried. Kennedy listened, answered when he could promise to carry their voices to Washington. By the time the room emptied, he and Sarah stood alone, the weight of the evening settling around them. "You meant what you said?" Sarah said, not a question, but a statement. "About making this bigger than you." Kennedy nodded, his eyes distant but resolute. "I've got a vote, a voice. If I don't use them now, what's the point? She smiled, just a flicker, and handed him a flash drive. "The video," she said. "Use it. Show them what's at stake." Back in his office the next day, Kennedy met with aides drafting letters to the Justice Department and state officials demanding a federal review of police training and disciplinary processes. He called for public hearings not in Washington, but in communities like Baton Rouge, where the people most affected could speak. The video, now verified and released with Sarah's permission, became a catalyst not just for outrage, but for action. Lawmakers who'd stayed silent began to speak up, wary of the public's growing demand for change. Kennedy didn't stop there. He reached out to advocacy groups, sat with families who'd lost loved ones to police misconduct, and pushed for legislation that would tie federal funding to police reform. It wasn't glamorous work bills moved slowly, compromises, diluted ideals, but it was real, and he knew real change took time. The lesson of that night on the highway wasn't just about Carnes's cuffs or Blake's suspension. It was about responsibility, the kind that starts with one person choosing to act, whether it's raising a phone or raising a voice. Kennedy learned it from Sarah, from the crowd at the community center, from the stories that poured in after the video went viral. Justice wasn't a moment. It was a movement built on the courage of ordinary people who refused to look away. For the people listening to this story, the message was clear: you don't need a title to make a difference. Speak up, show up, hold the powerful accountable. The system isn't perfect, but it bends when enough hands push. Kennedy knew he couldn't fix it alone, but he could start where he stood, and so could anyone else. As he prepared for the next fight, a stack of letters from constituents on his desk, he felt a quiet hope, not in victory, but in the work itself, in the people who'd carry it forward long after the headlines faded.